sometimes the most terrifying message in a marriage is not the one you receive. It is the one your spouse never expected you to send back. At exactly 9:14 on a Thursday night, my phone buzzed while I was sitting alone at our kitchen island with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Vanessa's text appeared on my screen. "Don't wait up." That was all she wrote. No heart emoji. No explanation. No mention of where she was going or when she planned to come home. Just 3 words that, to anyone else, might have sounded completely normal. I stared at them for several seconds before typing exactly 9 words that would change both of our lives. "Hope you and Mark have fun." I pressed send, locked my phone, and took another sip of coffee. 5 seconds later, my phone vibrated. Then again. Then again. By the time 30 seconds had passed, there were 6 missed calls from my wife. Another text arrived. "What are you talking about?" Before I could even unlock the screen, another message appeared. "Marcus, answer your phone." Then another. "Who told you that?" I smiled, not because I enjoyed seeing her panic, but because panic has a strange way of revealing what honesty never will. If I had accused her, she would have denied everything. If I had demanded answers, she would have found excuses. But one calm sentence had accomplished what weeks of arguments never could. It made her tell on herself. The funny thing is, I never mentioned cheating. I never accused her of lying. I simply wished her and Mark a good evening. Everything that happened after that came entirely from her own fear. By the time my coffee was gone, she had called 17 times. I still did not answer. I wasn't trying to punish her. I just wanted silence for once. For nearly 3 weeks, silence had become my greatest teacher. I had spent years believing that trust meant ignoring little inconsistencies because love required faith. Then I realized trust was never supposed to mean pretending not to notice reality. It started with tiny things that seemed too small to matter. A dinner that lasted longer than expected. A work meeting that suddenly moved to Saturday afternoons. A new password on her phone that she laughed off as a security update. Individually, none of those things proved anything. Together, they formed questions that refused to disappear. I never searched through her phone. I never followed her car. I never hired anyone to investigate my own marriage. I simply watched, listened, and remembered. People reveal far more than they realize when they believe no one is paying attention. Vanessa had always been confident. She believed she could read every emotion on my face. She believed if I wasn't yelling, I didn't know anything. She mistook patience for blindness. She mistook kindness for weakness. She mistook my silence for ignorance. Tonight, for the first time, she understood how wrong she had been. Another call came through. Number 18. Then a voicemail notification. Then another text. "Marcus, please. This isn't what you think." I looked at those words and quietly shook my head. That was the first real confession of the night. She still had no idea what I thought. She only knew what she feared I knew, and sometimes fear tells the truth long before people ever do. 3 weeks earlier, nothing in our house looked broken. Every picture still hung straight on the walls. Every bill was paid on time. Every Sunday morning still began with pancakes and music playing softly from the kitchen speaker while Vanessa watered the flowers on our back porch. If someone had looked through our front window, they would have seen an ordinary married couple living an ordinary American life. That was the strange part about trust. It rarely disappeared all at once. It faded quietly, one unnoticed moment at a time. The first thing I noticed was not a lie. It was hesitation. Vanessa had always answered simple questions without thinking. If I asked what time she would be home, she answered immediately. If I asked where she wanted to eat, she already had 3 ideas. Then one evening I casually asked who she was meeting after work, and she paused for just a second before saying it was a few people from accounting. It was only a heartbeat, but I had been married to her for 8 years. I knew the rhythm of her voice better than I knew my own. A few days later, she came home carrying a new leather tote bag. I complimented it, and she smiled a little too quickly before saying she had found it on sale during lunch. The explanation arrived before I even asked the question. That caught my attention more than the bag itself. People who tell the truth usually answer the question they are asked. People who feel nervous often answer questions that have not even been spoken. Still, I refuse to jump to conclusions. Everyone has stressful weeks. Everyone acts differently sometimes. I reminded myself of that over and over. Then small changes began stacking on top of one another. Her phone, which used to stay charging on the kitchen counter every night, suddenly traveled everywhere with her. If she walked outside to check the mail, the phone came with her. If she went upstairs to fold laundry, the phone disappeared into the bedroom. Once, while we watched a movie together, the screen lit up beside her. She turned it over before I could accidentally see the notification. She acted so naturally that someone else might never have noticed. I noticed because she had never done that before. I never reached for her phone. I never wanted to become the kind of husband who searched through private messages looking for reassurance. If trust had to be found by spying, then it was already gone. Instead, I started paying closer attention to the moments no one rehearses. A sigh after hanging up a call. A smile that appeared while reading a message and vanished when she looked at me. A sudden interest in working late on projects she had never mentioned before. One Saturday afternoon, she left to meet what she described as an old college friend for coffee. I smiled, wished her a good time, and stayed home to finish cleaning the garage. About an hour later, I realized I needed a replacement air filter for the furnace. The hardware store was only 10 minutes away, so I grabbed my keys and drove across town. As I waited at a red light near a shopping plaza, I glanced toward a small outdoor cafe. I almost kept driving. Then I saw Vanessa sitting at a corner table, laughing in a way I had not heard at home for months. Across from her sat a man about my age wearing a navy jacket. They were not doing anything inappropriate. They were simply talking over coffee. Yet something about the comfort between them felt older than a casual friendship. The traffic light turned green, but I remained still for half a second longer before the driver behind me tapped the horn. I drove away without looking back because, in that moment, I realized I did not need proof. I needed patience. The truth always moves at its own pace, and I had a feeling it was already walking toward me. I never told Vanessa about the cafe. I never mentioned the man in the navy jacket. I never asked whether his name was Mark because I already understood something far more important than his identity. If I confronted her with one afternoon and one cup of coffee, she could explain it away in a dozen believable ways. Maybe they were former classmates. Maybe they were discussing a business opportunity. Maybe they had simply run into each other by chance. One isolated moment rarely tells the whole story. Patterns do. So instead of collecting evidence against my wife, I started paying attention to the ordinary routines that most people stop noticing after years of marriage. Every evening when she came home, I greeted her exactly the same way I always had. I asked about her day. I listened to her stories. I laughed at her jokes. Nothing about my behavior changed because I wanted to see what happened when she believed everything was normal. Within a week, I noticed that one name kept quietly floating around the edges of our lives without ever becoming the center of any conversation. It appeared once when her phone briefly lit up while she was carrying groceries inside. I only caught the first 4 letters before the screen went dark. Mark. I immediately looked away because I had no interest in reading private messages. A few days later, she mentioned that someone from another department had helped solve a problem at work. She never said his name, but later that evening I overheard her telling her sister on the phone that everyone appreciated how dependable Mark was during stressful projects. The way she said his name sounded effortless, almost practiced. Still, I reminded myself that workplaces are full of friendships. I refused to let suspicion become imagination. Then another small detail arrived. We were cleaning the living room together on Saturday morning when Vanessa received a call. She glanced at the screen, smiled for a fraction of a second, and excused herself to take it outside. She had never done that before. I stayed inside, folded the blanket over the couch, and continued dusting the shelves. When she came back inside 5 minutes later, She smiled and said it had only been a coworker asking about next week's presentation. I simply nodded. She had offered an explanation before I had even asked the question again. That pattern was becoming familiar. Around the same time, I noticed another change that seemed almost insignificant. Vanessa started paying closer attention to her appearance on evenings when she claimed she had late meetings. She had always dressed professionally, but now she spent extra time choosing earrings, trying different jackets, and changing perfumes before leaving the house. None of those things proved anything. People are allowed to feel confident. People are allowed to enjoy looking their best. What caught my attention was that those extra efforts never happened on weekends when we went out together. One evening, while she was upstairs getting ready for another late meeting, I walked into the garage to grab a flashlight. Her car was parked inside because she planned to leave in a few minutes. As I reached for the flashlight on the workbench, I noticed a folded receipt lying on the passenger's seat through the window. I did not open the door. I did not touch anything. But the store logo printed across the top was from a small boutique nearly 40 miles away, a place she had never mentioned visiting. I quietly turned off the garage light and went back inside. More questions appeared, but answers still refused to arrive. That was when I made one simple decision. I would stop trying to guess what was happening and instead allow the truth to reveal itself naturally. People who are living honestly rarely worry about being discovered. People who are hiding something often expose themselves simply because they become exhausted from remembering which version of the story they told yesterday. Once I stopped chasing answers, something unexpected happened. The answers started finding me on their own. I was no longer looking for dramatic moments because real life rarely works that way. Instead, I paid attention to the ordinary details that people overlook when they are busy defending a story they want to believe. Vanessa seemed more relaxed than she had been in weeks. Looking back, I think she mistook my silence for acceptance. Since I was not asking difficult questions, she probably assumed I had stopped noticing the changes altogether. In reality, I had simply stopped reacting. One Tuesday evening we were eating dinner when her phone lit up on the table between us. She glanced down for less than a second before turning the screen over. She smiled at me and continued talking about a new project at work, as if nothing had happened. I smiled back and asked whether she wanted more iced tea. That was all. I could almost see the relief in her expression. She expected suspicion. Instead, she found calm. A few days later she mentioned that her office would be staying late to prepare for an important client presentation. I wished her good luck and told her to drive safely. Around 9 that evening I realized I had forgotten to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy near her office. The store stayed open until 10, so I drove across town without thinking much about it. After leaving the pharmacy, I walked toward my truck when I noticed a familiar silver sedan parked across the street. It was Vanessa's car. The office building she claimed to be working in was dark except for the security lights in the lobby. I checked the time. It was almost 9:30. I sat in my truck for a moment, wondering whether she had simply stepped out for dinner with coworkers. Then I saw 2 people walk out of a nearby restaurant. One of them was Vanessa. The other was the same man I had seen at the cafe weeks earlier. They were talking comfortably, carrying takeout containers and laughing about something I could not hear through the closed windows. They reached her car, exchanged a brief hug that lasted only a second, and then drove away in separate directions. Nothing I witnessed crossed the line into anything inappropriate. Even so, one question echoed in my mind. Why had she told me she would be inside the office all night? I drove home without following either of them. By the time I reached our driveway, I realized that the hug was not what stayed with me. It was the unnecessary lie. If dinner with a coworker had been innocent, why hide it behind a story about working late? Over the next several days I replayed that thought more than the image itself. Eventually, another piece quietly slid into place. Saturday morning arrived, and Vanessa asked whether I wanted to visit her parents the following weekend. While we discussed the schedule, she casually mentioned that one of her coworkers named Mark had recently transferred into her department, and everyone appreciated how organized he was. She spoke his name so naturally that I almost laughed. For weeks, Mark had floated around our lives like a shadow without an introduction. Now he finally had one. I simply nodded and said it sounded like he worked hard. She looked directly into my eyes for a moment, almost as if she expected another question. None came. Later that evening, while she watched television in the living room, I sat alone on the back porch listening to the wind move through the trees. I finally understood something that changed the way I viewed the entire situation. I did not need to know every conversation she had ever shared with Mark. I did not need copies of messages or explanations carefully prepared after the fact. Trust is not destroyed by one hidden dinner or one unexplained meeting. It is weakened every time honesty becomes optional. And somewhere deep inside, I had a feeling that the biggest reveal was still waiting for the right moment to arrive. After that night near the restaurant, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped trying to solve the mystery of my marriage and started preparing for every possible future instead. The following Monday, I updated the spreadsheet where I tracked our monthly expenses, something I had always done, but rarely thought about. I reviewed our savings, our mortgage payments, our insurance policies, and every account connected to our household. Nothing dramatic. Nothing secretive. I simply wanted to understand my own financial picture without relying on assumptions. It felt less like preparing for a divorce and more like preparing for adulthood. At the same time, I became even calmer at home. I complimented Vanessa when she looked nice before work. I asked about her parents. I watched our favorite shows with her in the evenings. If she expected growing suspicion, she found the exact opposite. Looking back, I think my calmness gave her confidence. She laughed more. She relaxed. She stopped watching my face for signs that I had discovered anything. She believed the storm had passed before it had even begun. One evening she asked if I minded that she would be attending another work dinner the following Thursday. I smiled and said I hoped everyone had a productive evening. She thanked me for being understanding, then walked into the bedroom to answer another phone call. I stayed in the kitchen washing dishes, listening only to the running water. Years earlier I probably would have stood outside the bedroom door trying to hear every word. Now I realize something important. A relationship cannot be saved by collecting more secrets. It can only survive honesty that both people willingly choose. If honesty has to be forced, then it is already disappearing. During the next week, another small moment quietly settled into place. We attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends who knew us both well. Vanessa spent most of the afternoon talking with everyone, smiling easily and telling stories from work. At one point someone jokingly asked whether the long hours at her office were finally slowing down. Before she could answer, another neighbor laughed and said, "At least your husband is patient with all those late nights." Vanessa smiled, but for the briefest moment her eyes moved toward me. I simply nodded and said every career has busy seasons. She relaxed again. It was becoming clear that she measured her peace of mind by my reactions rather than by her own choices. That realization stayed with me for days. The following Wednesday I was cleaning my truck when my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it but answered anyway. A polite woman introduced herself as someone from a local charity where Vanessa and I had donated furniture several months earlier. She was calling to thank us and confirm whether we would be attending an appreciation event later that month. Before ending the call, she casually mentioned that she remembered meeting Vanessa and another gentleman during the donation pickup because they had arrived together in separate vehicles and helped load several boxes. I thanked her and wished her a pleasant afternoon. She had no idea that one innocent sentence had answered a question I never asked. On the day of that donation, Vanessa had told me she was delivering everything alone because I had been traveling for work. The woman on the phone had no reason to invent a story. She was simply remembering a kind interaction from months before. I never called the charity back. I never searched for surveillance footage or tried to identify exactly what had happened. Instead, I sat quietly on the tailgate of my truck and looked across the yard. Piece by piece, the puzzle was no longer forming because I was forcing it together. It was forming because the truth has a strange habit of introducing itself through ordinary conversations. That evening Vanessa came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and asked whether everything had been all right at work. I smiled back and said it had been a peaceful day. For the first time in weeks, that answer was completely honest, because I had stopped chasing certainty. I was simply waiting for the moment when the truth would become impossible for anyone, including Vanessa, to explain away. The Thursday she mentioned arrived with unusual calm. Vanessa left for work wearing a navy blazer I had bought her the previous Christmas, and before closing the front door she smiled and reminded me not to wait up because the team dinner might run late. I smiled back, wished her a productive evening, and watched her drive away. There was no anger in my chest anymore. Weeks earlier I had been searching for answers. Now I was simply watching choices unfold. After finishing dinner, I washed the dishes, fed our golden retriever, and settled into the kitchen with a mug of coffee. The house felt strangely peaceful. Around 9 o'clock my phone vibrated. Her message appeared exactly as she had promised it would. Do not wait up. I looked at the words for several seconds, not because I was surprised, but because they represented the final piece of a pattern that had been building for weeks. I remembered the cafe, the restaurant, the unnecessary explanations, the hidden phone calls, the charity volunteer, and every small inconsistency that had quietly collected without me forcing any of them together. I typed one sentence with steady hands. Hope you and Mark have fun. I pressed send and placed the phone face down on the table. 5 seconds later it buzzed. I did not pick it up. 10 seconds later it buzzed again. Then twice more. By the time 1 minute had passed, the screen was glowing almost continuously with incoming calls and messages. When I finally turned the phone over, there were already 11 notifications waiting for me. The first message read, "What do you mean?" The second said, "Marcus, answer me." The third asked, "Who told you?" Then came another, "It is not what you think." I quietly leaned back in my chair and stared through the kitchen window into the darkness outside. My heart was not racing. Instead, I felt an unexpected sadness because her panic revealed something more painful than any accusation ever could. She had immediately assumed there was something to explain. I had never accused her of anything. I had simply mentioned a name. Over the next 15 minutes the messages became increasingly desperate. She claimed she had been with coworkers. Then she said the dinner had ended early. A few moments later she insisted Mark had only stopped by briefly because everyone from the office had been there. Those explanations arrived without a single question from me. Every new message seemed to replace the one before it. I never responded. Instead, I opened the refrigerator, poured myself another glass of iced tea, and returned to the table. At exactly 9:38, my phone rang again. This time it was a video call. I declined it. Seconds later another text appeared asking me to please answer because there had been a misunderstanding. I noticed something interesting. Not once did she ask how my evening was going. Not once did she wonder whether I was all right. Every message focused on what I knew and how much I had discovered. Fear had completely replaced conversation. Around 10 o'clock I heard tires pull into the driveway much earlier than she had originally planned. The front door opened with surprising force, followed by hurried footsteps across the hardwood floor. Vanessa stopped in the kitchen entrance, breathing faster than normal, still wearing the same navy blazer. Her eyes immediately found mine. For several long seconds neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument could have been because both of us understood that the conversation we had avoided for weeks had finally arrived, and neither of us could pretend that life looked the same as it had that morning. Vanessa slowly set her purse on the kitchen counter without taking her eyes off me. The confidence she had carried out of the house that morning was gone. In its place was someone trying to calculate how much another person knew without asking the question directly. She finally broke the silence. "Marcus, please tell me what this is about." I looked at her for a moment before answering in the same calm voice I had used all evening. "I think you already know why you came home early." She immediately shook her head. "You are making assumptions." I nodded slightly. "Maybe. But notice something. I never told you what I was assuming. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The realization crossed her face almost instantly. Every explanation she had texted me during the past hour had come from her, not from me. I had never accused her of having an affair. I had never claimed she was somewhere she should not have been. I had only sent one sentence that included Mark's name. She pulled out a chair and slowly sat down across from me. Mark is just someone from work, she said quietly. Then why were you so afraid when I mentioned him? I asked. She looked toward the window instead of answering. Several seconds passed before she whispered, because I knew how it sounded. I folded my hands on the table. Vanessa, this conversation is not about one man. It is about dozens of moments when you chose to hide ordinary things that never needed to be hidden. She looked back at me with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. You have been watching me? I gently shook my head. No. I have been living with you. I explained that I never searched through her phone, never followed her car, never hired anyone to investigate her. I told her about the afternoon I accidentally saw her at the cafe while driving to the hardware store. I told her about stopping at the pharmacy and seeing her leave the restaurant after saying she would be working late. I mentioned the charity volunteer who unknowingly remembered meeting her months earlier with another man during a furniture donation. I carefully described each event exactly as it had happened without exaggeration or accusation. Every time I finished one memory, Vanessa quietly lowered her eyes. She never interrupted because there was nothing dramatic to deny. They were simply real moments that had quietly collected over time. After several minutes she spoke again. Nothing physical ever happened between us. Her voice trembled as she said it. I listened without arguing. Maybe that is true, I replied. But that answer does not explain why honesty slowly disappeared from our marriage. She covered her face with both hands and took a slow breath. I liked talking to him. It started as work conversations. Then coffee. Then dinners with other coworkers. Eventually I realized I was hiding those meetings because I knew they would hurt you, even if I kept telling myself they were harmless. I nodded sadly. And every time you hid one thing, hiding the next thing became easier. She quietly whispered, yes. Another long silence settled between us. It was different from the silence earlier that evening. This one no longer carried panic. It carried truth. For the first time in weeks, neither of us was pretending everything was normal. The facts no longer needed to be uncovered because they were finally sitting at the table with us. I looked at the woman I had loved for 8 years and realized that trust rarely disappears because of one unforgettable moment. More often, it disappears because of 100 ordinary choices that slowly teach two people they are no longer sharing the same life. The kitchen remained quiet long after the last words had been spoken. Neither of us raised our voices because there was nothing left to gain from turning pain into noise. Vanessa slowly wiped her eyes and looked at me with an expression I had not seen in a long time. It was not fear anymore. It was regret. I kept telling myself I would end the friendship before it became a problem, she said softly. Then every week I found another reason to delay having an honest conversation with you. I listened without interrupting. There was a time when I would have desperately searched for the perfect explanation that could erase everything we had just uncovered. That time had passed. Some truths cannot be undone simply because they are finally admitted. They can only be accepted. Vanessa took a slow breath and continued. I never stopped loving you, Marcus. But somewhere along the way I stopped protecting our marriage the way I should have. I nodded because those words sounded far more honest than any denial she had offered earlier that night. Love without honesty eventually becomes confusion. And confusion has a way of creating distance even inside the same home. I stood up and walked toward the living room window, looking out across the quiet neighborhood. Porch lights glowed softly along the street, and somewhere in the distance a sprinkler clicked across a freshly cut lawn. Everything outside looked exactly the same as it had that morning, yet inside our house nothing felt familiar anymore. Vanessa quietly joined me a few feet away. Can we fix this? She asked. I did not answer immediately because that question deserved more than a quick emotional response. Finally I spoke. I do not know whether a marriage survives one conversation. I only know it cannot survive if the truth arrives weeks after the lies. She lowered her head again. I understand. The following morning we both took the day off from work. Instead of pretending everything was normal, we spent hours talking about the decisions that had slowly brought us to this point. There were no dramatic revelations waiting around the corner. Mark was exactly who she had described, a co-worker who had gradually become someone she confided in instead of her husband. She admitted that she had enjoyed the attention, the easy conversations, and the excitement of sharing parts of her day with someone outside our marriage. She also admitted that every time she chose not to tell me about another lunch or another meeting, it became harder to return to complete honesty. Hearing that hurt, but it also confirmed what I had already believed. The deepest wound had never been another person. It had been the steady replacement of openness with secrecy. Over the next several days, Vanessa made choices without me asking. She informed her manager that she wanted to transfer to another team if possible. She ended all communication that was not professionally necessary with Mark and showed me the message she had sent, not because I demanded proof, but because she wanted her actions to match her words. I appreciated the effort, yet I also understood that trust cannot be rebuilt in a single afternoon. It grows slowly, just as it disappears slowly. One evening, nearly a week after our conversation, I found the old framed photograph from our first apartment tucked inside a hallway closet while organizing boxes. We were smiling on a tiny balcony with second-hand patio furniture and a future that seemed wonderfully simple. I carried the picture into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. Vanessa looked at it for a long time before quietly saying, "We spent years building what I almost lost one ordinary decision at a time." I looked at the photograph, then back at her, and realized she had finally understood the lesson that had taken me weeks to learn. Life-changing moments rarely arrive all at once. More often, they are built from countless small choices that seem harmless until one day they become impossible to ignore. The weeks that followed did not feel like the ending of a story. They felt like the beginning of a much more honest one. Vanessa and I agreed that rebuilding trust would never happen through promises alone. It would happen through ordinary days, consistent choices, and conversations that neither of us avoided simply because they were uncomfortable. We established simple habits that should have existed long before our marriage reached that difficult night. We ate dinner together without our phones on the table. We shared our schedules without treating basic questions as accusations. Most importantly, we stopped assuming the other person could somehow read thoughts that had never been spoken aloud. None of those changes were dramatic, yet each one slowly replaced uncertainty with clarity. Months later, I realized something unexpected had happened. I no longer thought about Mark every day. In fact, there were entire weeks when his name never crossed my mind. That surprised me because I had once believed he was the center of everything that had gone wrong. Looking back, I understood that he had never been the real issue. The real problem had been the growing distance between two people who slowly stopped protecting the honesty that had once made their relationship feel effortless. One Saturday morning, Vanessa and I returned to the same neighborhood cafe where I had first seen her sitting across from another man. This time we chose a table outside beneath the same row of shade trees. She looked around for a moment before quietly smiling. "I remember this place differently than you do," she admitted. I nodded. "So do I." We ordered coffee and talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the past, but about the future we wanted to build if we both continued making better choices. There were moments of laughter that felt natural instead of forced. There were also moments of silence that no longer felt uncomfortable because neither of us was hiding anything behind them. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Vanessa reached for my hand without saying a word. I squeezed it gently, understanding that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is deciding that the future deserves more attention than yesterday, while still remembering the lessons yesterday taught us. A year later, I found myself sitting at the same kitchen island where everything had changed with one simple text message. This time the coffee was hot, the house was quiet, and Vanessa was upstairs getting ready for a family dinner at her parents' home. My phone buzzed. A message from her appeared on the screen. Running a little late. Traffic is terrible. I will be home in 15 minutes. Love you. I smiled without thinking and replied, Drive safely. I will keep dinner warm. There was nothing extraordinary about those messages, and that was exactly what made them meaningful. Trust had quietly returned through hundreds of ordinary choices made one day at a time. I often think back to that Thursday night when a single sentence revealed far more than I expected. At the time, I believed the message had exposed my wife's secret. In reality, it exposed something much bigger. It showed both of us that truth does not become dangerous when it is spoken. It becomes dangerous when it is delayed. Every marriage faces moments that test patience, communication, and trust. Ours was no different. The difference came from what happened after the truth finally arrived. We learned that honesty is not something you offer only when you are caught. It is something you practice every day when no one is asking questions. That lesson cost us more tears than either of us ever wanted to shed, but it also gave us a second chance built on something stronger than assumptions. It was built on choosing, every single day, to make sure there would never again be a message that either of us was afraid to send or receive.